Hey everyone, thank you for joining us today. We're just going to wait another moment for a few more folks to sign on. Thanks. Hi everyone, welcome to the TBR Webinar series. Today, Senior Analyst Hristov and Senior Strategy Consultant and Principal Analyst Geoff Woollacott will be discussing digital transformation in 2020, how hype gets scale and substance. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping notes at the bottom of your screen, so you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and our survey. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a replay link as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Boz to begin the webinar.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you everyone for joining us today. As Sarah mentioned, I'm joined here by my colleague, Geoff Woollacott. Geoff and I work closely on many of those analyses that we're going to present today, especially around the emerging technology areas, as well as the broader implications on vendors' business models, as well as looking into the buyer's decision cycle. And most importantly, I think it's also how some of the macroeconomic changes are impacting those decisions and where, fit into the budgeting and purchasing cycle. So the three topics we're going to go through today, along with Geoff, we're going to look into a digital transformation spectrum from three angles. One will be buyers and what are they saying, how they feel about digital transformation services, which it certainly is starting to reach maturity in some industries and in some horizontal areas. And we're going to look at how those consultancies and IT services vendors are shaping up their strategy to respond to buyers' demand, and what are some of the elements for them, the vendors, to moving forward. We're also going to look into the actual vendors' performance in digital transformation services, which it can be somewhat a challenging task, considering there's so many areas of digital transformation and everyone has different definitions about it. We'll try to present, we'll present TBR's view of digital transformation services and some of the tangential areas that are impacting the performance, and call out some vendors that are performing better than others, and some of the strategies are for catching up. And last but not least, we'll look into how emerging technologies like blockchain and quantum are impacting the business models of those vendors, and what are some of those disruptions that they may have to prepare for along the way. So before we get into the topic discussion, I want to kind of set the stage in terms of how we look at digital transformation and what are the key phases. For some of you, this slide may look familiar because we kind of try to maintain and look into if we need to evolve in terms of how we present the evolution of digital transformation. The three main phases that we look into when we talk to buyers, when we talk to vendors coming from TBR's view, are substitution, which essentially is leveraging a new technology as a one-for-one replacement of an old technology. Extension phase, which we see a lot of activities happening today or shifting more towards are adding disruptive technologies that allow significant improvements of the existing ecosystem for the buyers. And true transformation, which essentially is transforming and changing the business model and how buyers are preparing for how the businesses will look into as we think about the next decade. 2020 is around the corner, so think about how they're going to operate in a new business environment. So really a continuum, as we call it, looking at how budgets and dollars are shifting essentially from left to right. But as we want to point into the next couple of slides, there are some hurdles along the way that vendors need to be aware of and they're preparing for. So the next slide, what it shows is it's coming from our Voice of the Customer research. It's part of our Digital Transformation Insight series, which we publish on a monthly cadence. We do conduct a semi-annual customer survey, as well as conduct a series of in-depth interviews with end buyers across Americas, Europe, and APAC. And we ask them a series of questions in terms of barriers and opportunities of adoption, where they see themselves in terms of in a digital transformation continuum. And one thing I have to point out, if you look on the far left, first before going to the graph, the dotted line, what it represents is the share of the respondents within that particular stage that are undertaking digital transformation initiatives. They're basically preparing. The solid bar is the one that actually doing it. The dotted line is the one they're preparing, undertaking the initiative, digital transformation initiative within the stage. The true transformation what happens is in the true transformation stage is we witness a decline in terms of the respondents who are actually doing true transformation. And when we start kind of digging a little bit deeper into the questions, what happened, you were so into it and a certain percentage was, a much bigger percentage was ready to do true transformation. Some barriers such as business process changes and digital integration and data quality and even management was not prepared for, ready to get into. So this buyer started to take a step back and started looking into what shit do they do. Are their business rules, are their business ready for the actual technology innovation? So that's where we start seeing a more of a middle of the stack, essentially, between the substitution and the extension phases, where most of the opportunities are occurring and where most of the buyers are looking into spend their budget. Extension stage remains the most natural jump-off point for digital transformation initiatives, as enterprises essentially can experiment with disruptive technologies within the familiar business operations, and they see the value in generating new insights. And then they can use those insights to reimagine their processes and to reestablish or rewrite some of their business rules. In a nutshell, a lot of the companies today are really trying to balance existing legacy IT architecture in a parallel universe with adding some new technologies. And they're also creating a data platform that they can manage the operations while they're reducing costs, but also improving customer interaction. So there's like several initiatives that they have to manage and leverage in that parallel universe. So that's kind of like where buyers are today, and in terms of like adoption phase and how it's set up. The implications for the vendors in that scenario is that they must use their strengths around business process transformation, around outsourcing, and really trying to support and kind of increase the stickiness when it comes to the long-term managed services opportunity that comes along with. But for that, they need also an advisory permission, although as we're going to discuss on the next slide, we start seeing the traditional consulting model starting to erode, and that kind of forces vendors to think a little bit more beyond just the PowerPoint presentations and trying to be a little bit more involved with IT discussions. So move on to the next slide. Again, still on the topic of buyers and vendors preparedness. It's a lot of text. I'm not going to go through all the single words here on that slide, but this is like it's direct quotes, and there's many more of those within our Voice of the Customer research that we go out and we try to identify key themes around the state of the market or how the vendors performing, getting a true feedback of which vendors care about and how they're actually stacking up, and some threats, as we have called out here, consulting at risk. A lot of the buyers are really, really kind of tired, essentially, of trying vendors to come in and sell them blue sky ideas without actual solutions. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, we see the IT buyer getting back in the driver's seat. While with advent of cloud in the last 5-7 years, line of business leaders were largely involved in influencing budgets when it came to cloud. Now with the emerging technology spectrum and digital transformation in general, the complexity has increased, and there's so many more new technologies that have to be stitched together. So line of business nor executives want to bear the burden and be responsible for pulling the trigger on particular technology, ergo the need for an IT relationship, and really trying to have them involved with and asking for, and since IT gets back in the driver's seat, they're expecting more pointed solutions and something that's really addressing a specific business problem with an IT. Although it's coming from an IT, the IT buyer has started to educate themselves on the business implications of IT, not just the speeds and feeds as it was in the past. It's certainly a challenging task for a lot of vendors to differentiate in such a crowded market, and especially as that persona is changing and how they've done their job in the past. We've seen some vendors trying to test new business model with like outcome-based solutions and trying to bear some more of the risk, of how they're adopting and trying to take more on themselves before they can deliver the IT stack in terms of sweetening up the deals. Some vendors are trying other tactics and trying to establish new KPIs and building IP and bundling IP into the value propositions. But most all are looking into a platform-based model where they're trying to deliver everything as a service, and it really kind of, again, is the most common approach is there's so much data that has to be stitched across front, middle, and back office. One thing that we start seeing a little bit more, a trend that we started looking into 2020 is more vendors are growing their base of certified resources for particular technology stacks like Microsoft and Google and Adobe and Salesforce, SAP and S4. So I think it's something that's going to start to make a difference in some of the vendors' performance, especially as we're going to talk a little bit later in the deck, there's some evolution of the relationship between a lot of technology partners and services vendors. But certainly vendors that are trying to bolster their resource base with certified resources in those technologies are gaining the attention of a lot of those buyers that are now tasked with managing complex IT environments. So that's kind of like the wrap-up of the first topic of like buyers' readiness, where they are in the extension and substitution phase, and how some of the vendors are preparing for themselves. I'm going to move on to the next topic to start looking into actually vendors' performance and how they are positioning. Before we dive deep into vendors' call-outs and whatnot, I want to make sure that the folks on the line understand that the middle, this is just a map. It's more of a map than a chart that we guys may be used to seeing from TBR. And the middle and the end, and the upper right, not necessarily mean those are the best folks or the most best performing companies, nor that the lower left corner means that those are the worst. It's just a map to portray vendors' value proposition and go-to-market efforts in terms of their core and portfolio offerings. So it's just a kind of like mapping the ecosystem, as we have it called out. It is a crowded space, and as you kind of arrows are pointing, a lot of those vendors are adopting new business models, new ideas to remain relevant. And while many things are changing, what's not changing, I think it's also important to remember here is, for example, India-centric vendors still rely on the low-cost leverage to drive a lot of their business. A lot of outsourcing contracts are still coming, and pricing is what helps India-centric vendors win. Consultancies are still driving managed services of pull-through as from their relationship with the C-suite and trying to be, really, increase that stickiness. The tech vendors, they're still predominantly largely getting involved into what we call close-to-the-box services. So those are their core capabilities. Those are, getting into that can expand to that next phase of as buyers are preparing for the budget cycles. What's changing along the way is we suggested earlier. So is market consolidation is something that we are keeping a close eye at. We have started seeing a lot of large acquisitions occurring in the last 12, 18 months. There's certainly some vendors like Accenture, for example, have been doing a slew of acquisitions, spending $1.3 to $1.5 billion a year on acquisitions over the last 3-4 years. But we're also seeing vendors like Capgemini pulling the trigger on a large purchase in France from engineering services. We've seen DXC buying Hristov. So there's certainly vendors are trying to realign their resource pyramids. We start seeing and hearing some layoffs starting to happen in certain vendors, and trying to be a little bit more streamlined because, as I point, especially the India-centric vendors, they're starting, still leverage the low-cost labor arbitrage as a key lever to win contracts, but not all the areas are, profitable, as well as they are starting to infuse automation in service delivery, which helps them they need to be a little bit more streamlined. We're also seeing vendors starting to productize the IP to protect and expand margins as well. And, if you think of that band and spectrum of vendors when it comes to productizing IP, we see India-centric vendors most threatened when it comes to protecting their margin band, and management consultancies is probably most opportunistic when it comes to actually shifting away from their core consulting model. I hinted earlier about the changing the alliance business model. We started to identify, and we hear some anecdotal stories about vendors being a little bit more exclusive with their technology partners. We hear Deloitte setting up a SAP Leonardo Center out in China, Accenture doing a Pegasystems Center of Excellence within the Liquid Studio. So there's some starting to seeing those that exclusivity. And while they might not be new to some of you in terms of how services vendors engage with technology vendors, for a while many of those services vendors tout vendor agnosticism. And while we don't anticipate to completely change that message, we expect to see some more of a deeper dive in a specific niche areas or sub-verticals where vendors must claim exclusivity and call out that this is their preferred technology partner, and this is where they actually drive most business with. So that's an area that we'll keep an eye on in 2020, both of our part of research and just conversations with vendors and buyers. So as you kind of think about that map we just show on a previous slide, on this slide, what we have here is a lot of numbers to start with, okay? And there's there's a reason for that, because TBR, that's kind of core value proposition, is modeling. So there's a number of vendors, a dozen plus vendors, most of you can recognize from the line, those vendors on the left. Then we look into the total services revenues for 2018, and then we have called out 4 areas that are tangential to digital transformation: cloud, digital marketing services, analytics and insights, IoT. So we have, each of those vendors represents, as part of a group like TCS, and Infosys and HCL, Wipro and India-centric, IBM and Accenture are part of, the global SI group, and then the management consultancies, Big Four, etc. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, each one of them. Those are numbers that TBR models internally. These are numbers that we have modeled based on conversations with vendors, buyers. We use our proven methodology to get into those numbers. But what I wanted to point out here is, in terms of why we have bolded some and why not others, is, so let's take, for example, IBM. In 2018, the services revenue was about $5 billion ahead of Accenture. But if you look at Accenture's emerging areas like cloud and DMS and analytics and insights are close to what IBM is doing in those areas where Accenture is also investing in terms of resources and capabilities and IP, and it's closing the gap, especially with digital marketing services and building a strong foundation for long-tail managed service opportunities within marketing operations, for example, which is giving Accenture some boost into the broader services revenue, which, if I recall, in the last quarter, on a quarterly basis, not on the annual basis, but on a quarterly basis, actually Accenture already in 2019 surpassed IBM's quarterly performance. So it's a combination, not just saying it's one particular factor, but just the areas where they've invested and starting to pay off and closing the gap within each other. TCS, for that matter, on the India-centric vendors, the largest India-centric vendors we cover, there's a disparity in terms of how they, their revenue performance is in each of the areas that in digital transformation we track. Analytics and insights, it's certainly a lot of the revenues are captured, are getting into, from their core value proposition, and some of the legacy systems are helping to drive analytics and insights revenue. But then digital marketing services for them is the smallest revenue bucket in terms of a new area. And it's kind of a normal in a way because TCS is not known to have a relationship with a CMO. And they've been refraining from doing acquisitions similar to Accenture, IBM, to get into that realm. They're still going after their legacy IT relationship, which is certainly giving them a good foothold in some of their cloud and analytics and insights, but maybe they're missing opportunity driving some bigger and broader awareness with new buyer personas as they emerge. On the consultancy side, we see Deloitte, Big Four, kind of having the most broad investments across all the digital transformation service areas, and they're kind of fairly evenly distributed in terms of revenue performance because Deloitte Digital, when they launched it, they started investing fairly, at an equal pace. Cloud is kind of catching up, but digital marketing was initially, but then it's kind of back and forth, but they're all doing a fairly consistent performance. EY and PwC are certainly not far behind from Deloitte, although they still, in many respects, they are trying to maintain the status quo as a business first, technology second. However, we start seeing them putting some efforts into building some solutions and trying to be a little bit more tech-oriented when it comes to selling the value proposition of the company using that productizing of IP element that I mentioned earlier. So it's as you can see, there's a lot of numbers, and it's every vendor, as we have called, which vendor earns the most from digital and how much do business lines differ. If you ask every single vendor, they'll say we have the most from digital because they have their own definition. That's why we use our definitions, and that's why we try to look where they're actually generating net new dollars versus old dollars bundled in the new services. If you go back to the initial substitution expansion phase, this is where the back and forth relationship between recognition of how buyers think about each of the solutions and how vendors are reacting to that particular opportunity area. So that's where if you start summing those revenues, if you start breaking them up, probably it will be more than 100% because there's an overlap, obviously, especially around advisory services, especially around managed services, but which we develop our definitions and we try to be as exclusive as possible when it comes to comparing apples to apples within particular service line. So, but as you think about the complexity of that ecosystem right now and where the environment is today, there's disruptors that are coming along the way and some business models that actually these vendors, some of them are thinking or investing a little bit more than others, but they are certainly around the corner. Some of them are in the infant stage, some of them are in the teenage years, you name it, but they are something that should not be avoided. And as we think about entering into 2020 and getting to the new decade, while there may be some challenges from a macroeconomic perspective, we think that technologies that are coming along the way, such as blockchain and quantum, will have some impact on the value proposition of the vendors, the go-to-market strategy, but also how the business cycle is managed from the buyer's point of view. Without turning over to my colleague Geoff, who I'm sure he has some couple words to say about emerging technologies, as he's been looking at them pretty closely.
Okay, thanks, Boz. If we could flip the slide. This is, for those of you who may or may not know, we have a quantum market landscape that we have put together. We have delivered one iteration of that, and the second one is in my inbox to content review, and I believe is publishing mid-December. This is a slide out of the first one, which is our best effort to provide a timeline of what we think is going to happen in quantum. Stephanie Long, who was the lead on the market landscape, and I attended a conference called Quantum Tech in Boston a couple of weeks ago. And a lot of the discussion about quantum was the fear among the scientists that have been diligently working on quantum for decades that the hype cycle is overinflated, and this will lead to disillusionment. It could cause some VC to pull back on some of their investments, and that customers or enterprises that could be looking at it may have a false sense of what can happen now with quantum relative to what the potential is of quantum. We, Stephanie and I, after interviews with a lot of experts in different vendors that are taking a lead in quantum, developed a term that we're calling economic advantage. And what we mean by that, we're not talking about quantum supremacy or the idea that the quantum system is superior to the classical system or any of that. We believe over time what will happen is you'll have sort of that leapfrogging, which reminded me of the transaction processing wars of an Oracle versus an SAP back in the 80s and 90s, and they tune things and say they're superior. IBM and Google kind of got into that a little bit about quantum in the last couple of weeks. But our definition of economic advantage is simply this, that in a live application, there will be at least a piece of that application that will be processed on a quantum system in a live app to generate some advantage. Now, what could those advantages be? These things, quantum, we're all moving to as-a-service models. And services, as my mentor pounded into my head years ago, were predicated on quality, timeliness, and price, with the idea being that the customer could control two, but the vendor had to control one in order to be able to, make money at that deal. I have translated these through interviews with folks. Quality in the quantum world, I would define as precision. Timeliness would be speed. And price, given it's do you want to do it or don't you want to do it, it's the cost. Price and cost are kind of stay together. So what you basically have is the need, as you're looking at this economic advantage, is the buyer, the enterprise, will have to evaluate the trade-offs of precision, speed, and cost. Now, going to this recent example of IBM and Google talking about Google's claim of quantum supremacy, and IBM looking at it and recalculating the math, I believe it was, taking a look at the math calculation, and then saying their Summit system, the classical system, could have done it in 3.5 days, which is far less than the Google claim, while the quantum output was done in a couple of minutes. So let's just take that example. Let's assume the outcome was something that you wanted. The cost comparison would be, what's it cost me to run a supercomputer for 3.5 days versus run a quantum system for about 4 minutes? Now, I don't know what those price variables are. This is something that hopefully I'll be writing up in a couple of weeks. I've been talking to Boz about it. But these are the types of trade-offs that are going to come. Now, as quantum improves, it's still in the transition from science into engineering. So there's still discoveries that have to happen to improve things like fidelity, which is, I think that's the new term that people are using rather than entanglement, which means the same thing apparently. So the fidelity of the systems will improve. through continued scientific evolution, then getting into engineering, getting into the component supply chain, and hardening these systems. But today, with current fidelity, there are things within, we'll say, about a year, year and a half, that will start to be running as live applications. As the fidelity improves, the precision can improve. If that precision improves, quality, then the cost trade-off of, well, if we do this in quantum, generate greater precision, and that has a certain cost, you have to compare that cost against the way we're doing it today and what we have to do with the output. So let me now stop talking theory and give you an example, which would be, say, for chemicals research. Under current supercomputers, let's just, for argument's sake, say the precision of what you find out can go to 1 decimal point. If, however, under quantum, it may be a more expensive build for the compute, you could get 4 decimal point precision, then you're going to have less human time in the labs, wet labs, doing the experimentation to figure out the modeling that the quantum system will be able to do. So these cost trade-offs of this is the way we do it today, this is the way we can do it now, these are all sort of the comparisons that are going to have to happen, and it's as much the computing itself and then what it strips out as far as labor goes. And to get there, to go back to really what Boz has been talking about in the list of those charts, and the need, when you said, what was it, consulting at risk?
Yes.
Is that the term?
Yeah.
Consulting at risk really, in my opinion, is coming down to the fact that the IT side of it is becoming less and less important. And by that I mean the people side of IT, because what's been going on in upsetting I'll call it more the hardware side of this industry for decades, has been, the first leg of that was virtualization. We pretty much got it in server and storage. We're a third of the way through it on the network. Virtualization. From virtualization came standardization, and then from standardization can come automation, which means you can take labor out of the equation, because you're talking about zeros and ones in engineering. Virtualization, standardization, automation, lights out data centers. Now flip it over to the business side, the line of business side. You don't necessarily have virtualization, but you need standardization in order to get to automation, and standardization is business rules, and that's where the advisory services firms come in. So consulting at risk it's no longer this separation between strategy and tactics. It's a convergence. I was reading an article last night from Harvard Business Review. I believe they called it agile planning. I had been joking internally with Boz of calling it stractics, like DevOps. The two have to come together because of speed. So those components all are working to make it more about the business rules and less about the technology, with the big exception being the speed that quantum is going to be able to impose on business decision-making that is already struggling to keep up with the speed that we have just under classical. So that's kind of my ramble on quantum. Now we'll jump over to blockchain.
I think just in a train of thought of the vendor-specific examples, from the services side, as Geoff pointed out, there's certainly great opportunities, but also not all vendors are placing bets yet.
Right.
So we've seen some like IBM and Accenture and Atos getting into the quantum a lot more on the software side and managing the application layer. Microsoft as well are developing Python-based languages that can actually run the simulations. So these are vendors that are seeking out for what's the next kind of frontier, essentially. There's a couple of use cases here, from each vendor that we have heard on the pharmaceutical side, on the energy side. There is certainly and some collaboration with universities. So it's certainly something to watch out for. But the investment on the hardware side and the actual physics side does require a broader partner ecosystem, which many of the services vendors are kind of like partnering with the same vendors, I would say, right?
Yeah.
You call it that way, Geoff?
Well, the first article I wrote on this in 17, the headline was same plot, shorter film. And by that I meant if you look at how classical computing, rose and fell, you had minis and you had peer-to-peer PCs, then you went to client server. You kind of had a dead cat bounce of PCs, and you got into client server, et cetera. You had minis in there. That took about a 15, 20-year time period. At least a portion of this market is the same place where Cray boxes were being sold in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then general purpose computing would catch up and Cray would continue to innovate. And that's a little bit of a different game because it's going to be able to be delivered via the cloud. It's probably in many cases will be the way it's delivered. And recently what you're seeing among the major, I'll call it hardware vendors in the quantum space, they're already peacefully coexisting with the other architectures. IBM in the recent announcement said they would, have the connections over to IonQ, which is ion trap technology versus their superconducting technology. And what that basically boils down to is, what have we learned? We've learned about virtualization and standardization and open software. So therefore, we're already going to be way far ahead in the quantum space, building those tracks, those compilers and the runtimes and the connections between old and new that we didn't have as we were finding our way around the Moore's Law arc of silicon, where you had proprietary operating systems, and therefore you really had to make a huge bet on the hardware and software of a single vendor as you were trying to build a business app. And like a firm such as Accenture, at least 2 years ago when I heard them speak about this, they're doing it in the labs. They're staying vendor agnostic. They're not really doing any research unless they have a client who has a business problem that they feel can lend itself to quantum, and then they're doing it sort of as a joint venture, and they're staying sort of system or hardware agnostic. Rigetti is somewhat playing the same game, as is Xanadu, QCware.
One qubit.
One qubit. There's a bunch.
Yeah.
So we've all learned the lesson of the value to the customer of open standards, and those standards are evolving, and they're the tracks are getting laid down. Okay, so we can move. So blockchain takes it almost from another side. Blockchain's fascinating in the sense that it's the first major change, distributed ledger is the first major change to kind of business rules since the late 1400s, just call it 1500, when general ledger accounting was invented in Italy, according to Wikipedia. I was born a few years after that, but it was around 1500. So the issue here, and a lot of the different strategy firms are essentially saying the same thing when they talk about, I believe it's EY that uses it, it's the one I like the best, is now, next, and beyond. So you're doing sort of your design thinking in the now to determine what is it you can do, but while you're doing that, your aspirational objective is that goal at the top. And so the first thing, that dark blue, is this is what we have, this is what we can do. And then you've got to find your ecosystem participants, and this is the change in business models. This is to these collaborations of these consortiums. It's also the change in kind of how you're partnering up to build sort of the next, which is a value to your ecosystem participants, so you can springboard it to whatever your beyond aspiration happens to be. And the examples that are there is in the revenue sharing or in the business model participations. You've seen it with like IBM and Maersk created one, which is like a 51-49 split. It's also been done with Walmart on food service. EY's worked with Microsoft on one for developer royalties that then can be used for other things, because again, the technology of blockchain is not that difficult. The difficulty comes in determining the business rules and the permissioned access. It's changing, it's the business process change. The reason why, at least in my head, the strategy firms or the strategy-led firms are a very serious threat for what I'll call the tech-led firms, because the tech-led side, if we automate this stuff, I mean, IBM bought Red Hat for to put a stake in the ground to kind of turn that into a very simple control plane, which they hope that they can control because the mainframe has 80% of the data. I mean, it's a big bet. We all have our opinions of that bet, but that bet is an underpinning to why the strategy firms, at least in my opinion, are the ones that have the better advantage for services revenue capture over the long haul. The folks that keep, Boz and I keep going back and forth on this. I've been waiting for the labor arbitrage firms to start having serious problems. It isn't happening. I could be dead wrong, but every time Boz is putting together his global delivery benchmark, I come over to see what the operating margin models are like and see if I'm right yet, and I'm still wrong.
Oh, it's coming.
Is it?
So it's almost Christmas, but yeah. In terms of, I think I mentioned earlier, the India-centric vendors are the ones who see the most pressure in terms of their percentage of their revenue, especially on operating margin, to Geoff's point. And we see the, middle ground, mid-teens kind of operating margin band as the kind of a golden standard for the future.
Yeah.
So it means that India-centric vendors have to come from the mid-20s to mid-teens, which is a big hit, essentially, which will come obviously from cutting, just adjusting to the pricing pressure of the market from the legacy services, also trying to monetize IP, et cetera, et cetera. So there have to be some adjustments and realignment to their business model, but also expectations with the stakeholders, because they cannot just tout, we're going to deliver 25% operating margin quarter after quarter in 2020. That's just not feasible today. Yeah. In reality, just because there's so many more technologies that can do so much for less, essentially. So, and blockchain is a perfect example of how those and quantum are going to be disrupting more and more the vendors. Certainly, we're looking into our predictions for the services industry in 2020. We'll be publishing a paper within the next month and have a webinar in mid-January. One of the predictions we are looking in 2020 is there'll be a downturn in terms of the economy. Probably it's not surprising to many of you, but we're going to dive a little bit deeper. What does it mean to everything we just talked about in terms of digital transformation? If it's going to put a big speed bump, what's going to be the height of the speed bump of many of those technologies, and which vendors will be able to address those faster than others, and what does it mean by 2025, as we talked about earlier, looking at who's going to kind of separate themselves from the pack and whatnot.
Yeah, I just was on a client call asking, they were looking for sort of the advisory or planning side of what to do, assuming a downturn. It's safe to say a downturn ought to be here. We've been in the longest economic run-up in a while. Clearly, we will have a downturn at some point. When exactly, who knows? And the downturn advantage for the big can get bigger in the downturn advantage if they have some working capital and they want to go gain share in a down market. Now, from a digital transformation perspective, in that substitution, you have aging technology. You can't get an extra life out of the single core, single socket server or whatever you have. Maybe you flip the cloud. Maybe you do this, maybe you do that. If you're aggressive, and you can also, it likely will mean that digital transformation value messaging will be about optimization, meaning less labor contribution. The optimizations that you may want in a downturn, you already have to refresh. You might as well take a bath while the water's warm. Get these in, make some changes, reduce some staff labor componentry to it. But the point on blockchain goes back to you need global business rules and consistency of the application of those rules in this ecosystem participation. It's sort of EDI on steroids, which was just to take a look at the picture. Those business rules have to be standardized And then you need the API connectors into your legacy back office systems for financial reporting as a corporate entity, but the benefit is in agreeing to those standards. That's the enabling layer that blockchain gives. We had a question of how can quantum computing really be considered part of digital. I don't know if it is, but what it is an accelerant. For 18 months, I've been trying to find a way to have a chart of Moore's law and translate it to whatever IBM calls a quantum volume. The gentleman at Google, I can't remember his name off the top of his head, that has come up with his law. And basically, a new way I've heard it is whatever time it takes for, it's not every application that goes from classical to quantum, but it's a standard theme. I've heard it from 3 different people I've bounced this against, is if the time in classical is X to get something done, and by that I mean from the time you, the human, hit the carriage return or swipe or voice activate to send it to quote-unquote Skynet to get your answer. If it takes X in classical, it takes the square root of X in quantum. So we're already struggling with adapting to the speed of innovation, which is requiring agile planning rather than the legacy strategy planning, which was drop the PowerPoint and then they'll go figure out what IT can do and do an RFP and blah, 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 to here it is, give us some data, we'll show you tomorrow a sample. We're already struggling with the change management, the human change management under this sort of set of parameters, and we can take that time and cut it down to the square root of that time as quantum comes on board. So that is the pressure on human beings to keep up with the change, but the benefit is we'll be able to go out and start looking at the unknown unknowns. Who knows what we're going to be able to solve that's been an intractable problem, and who knows what new materials or new business model services or new scientific discoveries can come when human inquisitiveness can be the square root of the time it's been taking can be there to get this stuff done. I'm a bit of a fan on quantum. It's a long way away.
But that was a good transition into the last part of it, the question, the Q&A part, which you already kind of started with picking up a question from the audience on the quantum.
You've got a good one there from slide 4.
On the quantum, what did it say? Can you use an example to illustrate the 3 digital transformation phases? Do we need to go back to the slide 4, please, for a moment? Thank you. So the substitution phase, probably the easiest way to think about is shifting current infrastructure and applications from legacy to cloud-based consumption models. Maybe upgrading from Office 2013 to Office 365 is a good example to think about substitution. Then the extension phase is really about utilizing the analytics or IoT kind of sensors to capture, process, and disseminate data. So it's kind of like that. What does it give me for my next phase of the truth transformation in terms of a business model and doing business? And the truth transformation, probably kind of an old example, is the Netflix model, going from a subscription DVD to really trying online content in terms of kind of a broad-based digital transformation from a business side. Geoff?
I was one of the pieces in Netflix from Reed Hastings was I didn't know him well, but he went to the same college I did around the same time. So I read up on Netflix often. And one of the things that they did in that is that period of time when you could mail you mailed them back and forth. They knew that wasn't workable.
When Blockbuster opted out and just not didn't want to.
Right. But that was their interim step. That was sort of in a now, next, beyond. Their next was we'll mail them to you, but the beyond is written.
But that's essentially almost an extension phase for them because they are collecting the data of the customers and trying to understand what content works and what's the demographics and all that. So
absolutely. Absolutely.
Get to the next question, please. Where is KPMG on the chart? Is it this chart that was meant? So KPMG would be within the management consulting box. We haven't called them out. Certainly, we don't ignore KPMG. We track them closely within our management consulting benchmark. We started looking into some of their non-management consulting activities as well. We have identified them as a vendor that's playing catch-up, but certainly there's some growth opportunities for them in certain non-management consulting areas. But we would probably position them in that green box where PwC, EY, and Deloitte are. Questions? Why DXC is not listed on slide 8? We have so much room on the slide. But no, not to be ignorant on the question, but we wanted to kind of select vendor that are representing each of the groups that we track, that we also model numbers for. I do believe within our broader TBR database, we do have DXC that we track. So DXC is part of our IT services benchmark. DXC is part of our cloud professional services coverage, our healthcare IT services coverage, our analytics and insights coverage. We do, have model numbers for DXC. They were not plotted here, because we just wanted to kind of, have just the few examples just to illustrate. But like I said, we do track DXC substantially, and we do, and it's DXC is part of our broader TBR coverage beyond digital as well. What's the next one?
AWS not considered.
Is AWS not considered the top vendor in digital earnings? Oh, that's kind of a similar question to maybe the KPMG one was earlier. I mean, it boils down to, we often get the questions, how come you include this and you don't include that one? We do track AWS as part of our cloud business quality, our performance. We do see them as an active participant in terms of the infrastructure as a service. We do see them also as a vendor that is starting to disrupt some of the services companies in terms of their services revenues as we think about managed services. We don't include them right now in terms of the digital transformation, in terms of how those models are being numbered, because maybe they'll be just called out on the cloud, for example, right? And they won't have total services the way we define services for Accenture, or the same way we define IBM services. So it's a matter of both definitions, also as what's being included just as a purpose of the webinar today. But they're certainly part of our cloud coverage, and we are keeping close eye on within the professional services as we are aware of them trying to build up. The AWS is building up some services capabilities, but we see them more on the partner side at this stage of the game for the services vendors to drive managed services in the cloud area.
The other thing with AWS, and this is just my opinion, Megan McGrath, who's been following Amazon for years, her ears might be ringing from what I'm going to say next, but they're really more the commoditization disruptor that's driving the need for the services firms to change. It's not like you think of Amazon as you're going to go to Amazon for business advisory. You're going to go there once you've made your decision because the compute is cheap and it's secure and it's reliable because it's a sort of a proven leader. That's just a kind of a throwaway opinion. So we've got one. Do you really expect the inflection point on S-curve for quantum computing around 2029? Is it not too optimistic? Yeah, we've had people tell us we need to lay off the. Can you go back to the slide? Thank you. We hear that. Now, what we're getting, and I mentioned economic advantage, and we wrote, Stephanie Long and I wrote that like a year ago and said it would be about 2 years out. We keep testing that with every briefing we do with vendors. We give them the definition of economic advantage, and we ask them point blank, do you think that's too optimistic? Because as I said when I was on this slide earlier, the prevailing caution at Quantum Tech was don't add to the hype. So our definition of economic advantage is there. But every other person is talking about a better hardening of the technology, which will improve fidelity, which will improve quality, which will improve precision. So think of wet lab versus dry lab, and improved precision means a lot of labor stripped out of scientific research or better financial trading algorithms, or you name it. They're talking about that at about 5 years. So that's why we have that sort of steep bend. And then 2039 is kind of, who knows?
Yeah.
But there will be some use in the next year or two, and then it's going to take off. Quantum security is going to be a big issue in there, and that's what this iteration that's being published in the next couple of weeks is about. The one we're doing after that is quantum professional services, and Boz and myself and Patrick Heffernan will be taking care of that one. But, S-curve, we think it'll gain traction a little bit faster than a lot of the vendor customers we have who are wedded to the classical structures. Although some of them have started to, in the last 18 months, their opinion, it's been interesting to see their opinion start to sit up and take notice. Yeah. Our standard response on this one is, at a minimum, to enterprises anywhere, at a minimum, have a few data scientists that are using the software development kits to get ready for it. And what we say to the legacy services firms, the tech-led services firms who may be hip deep in classical, is start building out a professional services capability for those enterprises you have where you've got all the server farms. So when this takes off and they haven't been paying attention, you can come in with some of those bootstrap services to get their algorithms over to this new technology.
Okay, and then the last question before we wrap up, we're now almost at the top of the hour. How do you see DXC's recent reorganization decisions to reflect what's forthcoming with other organizations seeing downward pressure? I think I kind of, it's an interesting question. I think I hinted earlier about what we're expecting to see in 2020 in terms of broader market consolidation as a result of, what it is, and Geoff has been talking about, some vendors are just slow to adapt, to change. Could it be culture? Could it be the fact that they are, let's put it this way, they have value over values type of culture, meaning they're trying to support more the profit, secure the profit and the earnings per share for Wall Street, versus actually trying to align the DNA of the organization and what the capabilities are to the core and drive to make those changes. I think DXC is probably a little bit more of the former, just based on the organization has been always, and now they have the new CEO that came on board, and we saw, by the way, a number of CEOs coming on board, which with new leaders, question is, would there be new ideas? We start seeing some new ideas, so-called new ideas with DXC trying to make the reorganizations, but we would not be surprised to see others to follow suit. We see Cognizant starting to make some changes because they hired an outsider. DXC also hired an outsider. We see that vendors, they're a little bit more in distress, like DXC and Cognizant. Hiring an outsider is easier to make those decisions because they don't have the emotional connection with maybe some of the board members and top executives to make some of those changes. Vendors that are doing maybe a little bit better, it may sound a little bit more in favor here, but someone like Accenture or Capgemini, Atlas promoting within, they are doing a little more steady, and in some markets actually expanding share. So I think the companies that are in distress and looking to being slow to adopt those changes we've been discussing over the last hour will likely have to make those changes. I think some of the India-centric vendors and consolidation within the India-centric vendors will likely occur sooner rather than later. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah to wrap up the webinar.
All right, everyone, please feel free to reach out to the team with any more follow-up questions. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen. A replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. Be sure to join us on Wednesday, December 4th for Device Market Disruptors. Thank you and have a great day.